Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming today. I'm J.D. Gordon, a senior fellow with the Center for a Secure Free Society. I'm glad you could attend our event today. It's co-sponsored by the Daniel Morgan Graduate School and our media partner, NTN 24 Television, which is an international network with headquarters in Colombia. We have a lot of national security and economic expertise in Latin America from the center, with a few decades collectively there. I remember my first time in Venezuela, actually, was 1999. I was the Navy spokesman for all of our forces in Latin America. And I was there just after Hugo Chavez was elected. And I remember our military counterparts had a lot of concerns about his socialist policies and the fact that he had attempted a coup just 7 years before that. But I would have never imagined back in 1999, and I don't think most of them would have imagined either, that about 4 million Venezuelans would have left the country by now from then. So by statistics, since Venezuela is a country of roughly 30 million people and the U.S. is about 320 million, that would be like if over 40 million people left the United States within a 20-year period, which is almost unimaginable. Venezuela is rapidly becoming the Syria of Latin America in terms of refugee outflows, and we're so delighted to have an all-star panel with us. We have a short film to show you that our colleagues, Joseph Humar, Mark Walker, and I went down to the Summit of the Americas in Lima in April, and certainly Venezuela was at the top of everyone's conversation there. So with that, I'd like to introduce a short film. For Rachel, if you could show the film. Thanks.
Queridos alumnos, señores miembros del claustro, distinguidos expositores, muchas gracias por estar aquí en nuestra casa, en una casa que busca la verdad y que defiende la libertad, en la Universidad San Ignacio de Loyola.
Entonces, si vemos el análisis de Venezuela, no tiene prensa libre, el sistema judicial está cooptado por el chavismo, la oposición perseguida e inhabilitada, inclusive el derecho de protestar, el sagrado derecho al pataleo. La elección no es suficiente.
La discusión sobre Venezuela merece una discusión mucho más seria de lo que hemos tomado no simplemente en Washington, pero también en el marco de nuestros aliados en América Latina.
Yo quiero que se vaya Nicolás.
La participación que ha tenido y sigue teniendo Diosdado Cabello en el narcotráfico en Venezuela y Latinoamérica es más que probada.
¿Quién lo subvenciona? ¿De dónde puede conseguir ese dinero? No se lo dan del extranjero, lo tienen que sacar del narcotráfico. Venezuela está tomado por bandas activadas por el narcotráfico internacional.
El propósito de este panel, de esta discusión, es tratar de buscar cuáles son las soluciones.
Para comprar cosas de Venezuela, yo fui a Venezuela hace 20 años, pero yo escuché ahora que necesita tener un saco entero para comprar cosas. ¡Qué locura!
El pueblo no logra retomar su poder soberano. Ya tenemos que ir a otras instancias.
Tenemos que ser solidarios, niños, adultos, mayores, que mueren en manos de esta terrible dictadura.
Señor, en este momento y a esta hora, te entregamos nuestras vidas, porque sabemos que estamos, papá, entregándonos.
While we're waiting for the congressman to arrive, I'd like to go ahead and welcome the Dean of Academic Affairs from Daniel Morgan Graduate School, Dr. Stephen Meyer.
Thank you. It clearly helps to understand and speak Spanish, which I do not. So please forgive me if I repeat anything that was said up there. I want to welcome you on behalf of the Daniel Morgan Graduate School of National Security and the Center for a Secure Free Society. We have had a partnership with Joseph and his folks for some time. It's been a mutually beneficial and enriching experience. We are glad that you are here for this important conference. It concerns a growing human tragedy in the Western Hemisphere. Sadly, these kinds of refugees crises have become all too common in the past decade all over the world. It is a new phenomenon, the likes of which we have not seen before. We see it in Europe, we see it in Asia, we see it in Latin America. And we have not caught up with it. We do not deal with this satisfactorily as civilized human beings. Venezuela, as we all know, is in severe crisis, and it is a crisis that's spread beyond the borders of Venezuela. According to Mercy Corps, the economic and social collapse of Venezuela has caused 1.5 million people to flee. The minimum monthly, that's monthly, wage in Venezuela is now reported to be the equivalent of $2 US. Hunger, malnutrition, starvation have become all too common hallmarks of this crisis. The crisis has caused untold deaths, especially among children, including malnourished newborns. A shortage of medicine has led to disastrous results for even the most common treatable diseases. The test of what we do here today is not so much in the words that are spoken, as important as they will be. Rather, the true test will be the action that comes out of this conference to try in some way to help address this tragedy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Meyer. And the dean had been over at National Defense University for 13 years before going to Daniel Morgan Graduate School. So we thank you for those great remarks. While we're waiting for the congressman to start, I'll just go over some of the particulars of the event. We have index cards available for questions and answers for about the last 20 minutes of our program today. We're going to take questions from the audience. Our great moderator, Emiliana Molina from NTN 24, will be taking those questions via the index cards. So if you do have any index cards, please pass them over to your left on that side and the right on this side prior to about 11:30 or so. And Max will come around and collect them up and give them to Emiliana. So I'll introduce the panel now, and then when the congressman gets here, he'll start. So we have Emiliana Molina here, who's from Colombia originally. And Joseph and I know her from Univision, local here in Washington, D.C., where she was a stellar reporter there. And so great, she got a White House Correspondents Association scholarship. Actually, there, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And also, congratulations to NTN 24 because they just won several Emmys, several local Washington, D.C. Emmys. Our friend and colleague, Gustavo Alegret, who was is their news director. He was going to be with us today. Unfortunately, had to go downrange to Nicaragua. A lot going on there now. And then Mexico for the elections. And I think we'll hear a lot about that very soon. So we have Emiliana with us. We have our executive director, Joseph Humar. Joseph is a former Marine. He is an Iraq combat veteran. And Joseph served in Latin America too, like I did on these deployments called UNITAS. And we've had those since the late 1950s, and they had traditionally been circumnavigation exercises with about 5 or 6 ships and Marines as well. So I did UNITAS in the 90s, Joseph did it in the 2000s, and Colonel Preston McLaughlin on the end did it in the 1980s. So we're all UNITAS veterans here. We also have with us today, we're fortunate to have Ambassador Roger Noriega from AEI, and Roger Noriega is also a good friend and colleague for many years. He was the Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs under President Bush, and he was also the ambassador to the Organization of American States, a brilliant author and columnist too. So we're very pleased to have Roger here with us today. We have Dr. Evan Ellis, who is a research professor of Latin America Studies at the Army War College, and I always look forward to his columns too because they have such great insights on what's going on in places like Mexico and what China's doing in Latin America. So if you'd like to sign up for his list, I'm sure he would be happy to sign you up. To share some of that great knowledge. And Colonel Preston McLaughlin is a professor at Daniel Morgan Graduate School. He is a retired career Marine officer. He was a colonel, and he was a career Amtrak officer. So near and dear to my heart because I've worked with the Marines throughout my career. I'm a retired Navy commander. So we've got a great Navy Marine Corps team here for sure. So with that, I think, where's EJ and the congressman? Is congressman here? Well, since he's not here, why don't we go ahead and get started with the panel. Basically, Emiliana is going to ask the panelists different questions as if it was a TV interview. So, Emiliana, I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
Hello, can you guys hear me? Good. Okay. All right, welcome everyone, and thanks for being here. So, I'd like to start with actually the most recent news. Yesterday, Vice President Mike Pence announced in Brazil nearly $10 million in additional humanitarian U.S. assistance for Venezuelans who have fled their country due to the man-made crisis there. The aid will help host communities in Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, and other countries throughout the region. Total U.S. humanitarian assistance to the Venezuelan crisis since the beginning of the fiscal year 2017 is now up to nearly $31 million. So what happens now, and what about those Venezuelans who cannot receive the aid and are still stuck in Venezuela? And I'll open it up to the panel.
Okay, well, with respect to what happens now, I think we're talking specifically about scenarios, and frankly, the situation is not encouraging. Probably the most likely scenario after the May 20th elections or fraudulent elections is the continuation of the status quo and a deterioration of the situation. If you look at Venezuela's economic situation, falling reserves now below $9 billion, with even only a part of that available. Falling oil production, I think revenue is down to about $22 billion from $70 billion where it was a couple of years ago. The bottom line is Venezuela just does not have the money to both pay the debts and import goods to feed its people and buy medicine. And so what you're really seeing is that humanitarian crisis. Some prospect with the recent shift in government with, for example, the shift of Diosdado Cabello to head the new all-powerful Constituent Assembly, that there could be some sort of future power transition in the works in an attempt to move towards a government that at least could get Russian and Chinese aid. But even in that situation, the ability to fix the economy is contingent largely on what Russia and China chooses to do and how the Western world responds to that, which is not promising. Probably the more concerning third possibility is a breakdown, either through a split in the military or other actions, which may or may not be controlled. But if it is not controlled with the various colectivos, with groups such as the FARC operating in the countryside, with other various violent groups, the prison gangs, the Paranas, and others, what you could have is really an escalation of violence with spillover, and that would be really the maximum refugee scenario. Of course, the Center for Free Society provides some very good numbers, some updated numbers. But overall, we're looking at this really only being the beginning, with already as many as 4+ million Venezuelans. Perhaps the least likely scenario is a transition to democracy, and even if that were to occur, the amount of money that would be required for really resettling refugees, some estimates are as much as 3.8 to maybe as much as $5 billion. And so again, the money available, while helpful, is really just a drop in the bucket. With perhaps as many as half of those refugees going at least temporarily to Colombia before some pass on to Ecuador, to Lima, elsewhere, in addition to those who pass into the Caribbean, Panama City, et cetera. This is really a huge cost that has not yet been fully borne by the region. So it's difficult to find a scenario in which things get better in the near future, but certainly the recognition and providing a little bit of alleviation is helpful.
Could just jump in? Go ahead. We all see the images of the refugees flooding out of Venezuela. It's extraordinarily dramatic, and if you haven't seen them, you should go to YouTube and see some of the other some of these images that are readily available. And let's be clear: this is being managed by the regime leaders who want to see people who are dissatisfied to flee the country. They've fled in airplanes. Now they're going by feet. You see people walking thousands of miles to try to find jobs and be able to survive, walking down the South American continent. It's really dramatic. And this is not a failure of the regime. This is a success of the regime. It's not a bug of the system. It's a feature of the system. They're busting out Venezuela like a mafioso would bust out a pizza parlor in Brooklyn. They've looted the country systematically. They've destroyed its institutions. They've destroyed the criminal justice system, so there is no security. And there's no checks and balances to look at the abuses of power and the looting of state assets. My guess is, in retrospect, we'll look back and this Maduro Chavismo Castro conspiracy will have looted at least $500 billion, and it's a minimum for their personal gain. And I mentioned Cuba. This is being micromanaged by Cuba. Castro was Chavez was probably a Castro agent when he did the first coup. Maduro is even more slavishly loyal to the regime. That's why the Cubans micromanaged the succession that put Maduro in power. And so all that you're seeing, all of this grief, insecurity, instability that you're seeing emanating from Venezuela is part of the ruination of that country, managed by the Cubans. And you have to figure, how long can we treat the symptoms? Because 10 million, 30 million is treating the symptoms of a disease that is going to affect, or even further, the security of the United States. When you see a crisis on the border, these are people that are being driven out of countries in Central America whose institutions have been destroyed systematically in the last 10 years. So there aren't economic options available for the populations there, and so they end up here. When you see an explosion of coca in Colombia because of an ill-conceived peace process with narco guerrillas, and you see the impact on insecurity up and down the transit zone, and impacting as far as markets in Europe and certainly in the United States. This is all being carried out by transnational organized crime, managed by willing accomplices in these various countries. And the United States and its neighbors, its allies in the region, really cannot handle this problem simply treating the symptoms. And I think that it's important that as President Trump puts his new team in place in the national security establishment, particularly in the State Department, that they start to consider more effective options in liberating Venezuela and sparing all of us the grief caused by the instability in that country.
Let me Let me add a little bit more to what Ambassador Noriega is saying. First, let me just say that it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for everybody for showing up, and particularly to Ambassador Noriega, who, for those that don't know him, he's done probably more for the Venezuelan cause than just about anybody in Washington. He's been very active, both with Venezuelan opposition, but also with U.S. policymakers to make sure that, I mean, I think back to even when you were in government for sure, but even back to 2008, 2009, when people weren't really paying attention, saying that this exact situation was going to happen. And now that we're here, I think we're all look for solutions. But I want to say, first let me be clear on what I want to start, and that's, we saw the video, you could look at the YouTube, the refugees, the folks in the internal place, also the internal displaced folks in Venezuela, these are the first victims of the crisis. These are truly the individuals that are suffering because of what's happened in their countries. So I want to be very careful about how I couch this, but I do think that there are certain inherent risks to providing humanitarian assistance and trying to work with the refugees, particularly for some of the things that Ambassador Noriega said, that this isn't a failure of what the regime has done in their country. This is actually exactly what they prepared to do in their country. And because of that, I think we have to be very careful that we don't walk into an ambush, similar to things that have happened in the past in other parts of the world with humanitarian assistance, such as Somalia in '93 or Libya even more recently. We have to be very smart about how we provide humanitarian assistance to Venezuela, because there's equally a concern not just to be able to protect the refugees, but also to make sure that these routes that are moving out of Venezuela don't get contaminated with individuals that have ulterior motives. One of the things you'll see, there's a fact sheet that's on everybody's chair, and one of the things you'll see in that fact sheet is there's a phenomenon that's been growing within the national security establishment, that's particularly in the Department of Homeland Security, which is called special interest aliens, SIAs, for those that are in the lexicon of the Department of Homeland Security. SIAs are a subcategory within something called other than Mexicans. So essentially, the way the Department of Homeland Security categorizes undocumented migrants that are coming across the border is into Mexicans. Obviously, there's a lot of Mexicans that come in. Other than Mexicans, which are mostly Central Americans. And then within that, there's SIAs. And SIAs is a collection of 35 countries around the world, mostly not in Latin America. I don't think any are in Latin America, mostly in Africa and the Middle East, that have a heavy density and presence of terrorist groups, foreign terrorist organizations. So if essentially SIAs are the movement of potential terrorists moving throughout the Western Hemisphere. Now, Venezuela, and I know the panel knows this very well, Venezuela has played a special role in facilitating the movement of SIAs throughout the Western Hemisphere because they've legitimized their presence. They provided them documentation, they provided them identities. Some of those that have done this work and worked with Congress on this, a lot of talk about passports, that they provided passports to members of foreign terrorist organizations. And that's that's not actually just the concern. I mean, that a foreign terrorist could get a passport from a country and use that passport to move throughout the world is not a new phenomenon. That's happened throughout the history of terrorism. What makes Venezuela different is they're not just providing passports, they're providing complete identities, a chain of custody of records from birth certificates to driver's license to bank records to passports to national ID cards, so that you have individuals that never stepped foot in Venezuela but can move throughout the world and say that they're Venezuelan. And that's a tremendous, that's a blind spot for those that are in immigration security and national security. And our regional allies in Latin America are not prepared to deal with that. So going back to the humanitarian assistance question, I think we equally have to provide counterintelligence support to the countries that are going to be dealing with the refugees, primarily Colombia and Brazil. They do not have the counterintelligence capabilities to determine and detect if these are all legitimate refugees. This is a replay of the conversation we had in Syria, where there's unverified and unvalidated mechanisms to determine who's actually subverted the system. This is not to say that even a large percentage of the refugees are contaminated with this, but as we all know, since 9/11, it takes very little to do a lot of damage. And if there is, God forbid, any kind of terrorist action or any kind of nefarious action that takes place throughout the Western Hemisphere, and then you look in the pocket of the individual that took out that action and you find a Venezuelan document, that's going to be disastrous for the entire community of the Venezuelan refugees, and we have a responsibility to make sure that does not happen. So I think, yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, we're delighted to have the Congressman with us here today, Congressman Rothfuss from Pennsylvania, and my colleague E.J. Kimball, who's a senior fellow with us at SFS, is going to introduce the Congressman.
Thank you, and good morning. JD mentioned I'm E.J. Kimball, senior fellow on Middle East with SFS. Congressman Rothfuss, Keith Rothfuss, represents Pennsylvania's 12th Congressional District, which includes all of Beaver County and portions of Allegheny, Cambria, Lawrence, Somerset, and Westmoreland counties in western Pennsylvania. He's here in Congress fighting to reduce federal regulations and promote free enterprise so that the economy can grow at a healthier pace and create jobs. Congressman Rothfuss is passionate about ensuring that America remains the land of opportunity and freedom that the founders intended it to be. He was sworn in this term on January 3rd, 2017, and is serving his third term in the U.S. House of Representatives. Congressman Rothfuss was appointed to serve as Vice Chairman of the Subcommittee on Financial Institutions and Consumer Credit, and also serves on the Subcommittee on Housing and Insurance, as well as the Subcommittee on Terrorism and Illicit Finance. The committee has jurisdiction over monetary policy, international finance, international monetary organizations, and efforts to combat terrorist financing. Congressman Rothfuss is also a member of the House Judiciary Committee. This committee has jurisdiction over federal courts, law enforcement, immigration, civil liberties, and criminal justice. Using his position on the committee and the subcommittees on courts, intellectual property, and the internet, as well as the subcommittee on crime, terrorism, homeland security, and investigations, he will protect and advance American safety, freedom, and prosperity. Congressman Rothfuss has used his position in Congress to bring attention to the opioid crisis and has taken a leadership role to stop this horrific problem ravaging our country by attacking the problem from production to consumption. Congressman Rothfuss is a personal friend, and it is an honor to have him with us today. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Keith Rothfuss.
Thank you, EJ, and good morning, everybody. And I want to also thank the panel for this important work that you're doing, the Center for a Secure, Free Society and the Daniel Morgan Graduate School of National Security. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I want to touch briefly on American relations with Venezuela, especially as it relates to the humanitarian crisis, energy production, and current legislative actions. Historically, the United States has had close relations with Venezuela because the country was a major U.S. foreign oil supplier. However, current Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro continues to restrict the civil liberties in his country and trample on human rights, just as his predecessor, Hugo Chavez, did. Venezuelan citizens have been killed, tortured, and arrested for participating in pro-democracy protests. If anyone in our country thinks that socialism is a good idea, take a look at Venezuela. The Venezuelan government has repeatedly limited freedom of speech and used its judiciary to intimidate its citizens. These actions are inappropriate and offensive. Congress and the administration is deeply concerned about the Maduro's regime affiliation with terrorist groups, proliferators of weapons of mass destruction, cyber criminals, and human rights abusers. As a member of the Financial Services Committee and Subcommittee on Terrorism and Illicit Finance, we have grave concerns about Venezuela's lack of bilateral cooperation on counter-narcotic and counter-terrorism efforts. According to the U.S. State Department's annual report on money laundering and financial crimes, the Venezuelan government was associated with organized crime, corruption, human trafficking, and fraud. Venezuela was also identified as one of the countries with the most rapid growth in potential trade-based money laundering activity. While we desire to assist those who need our help around the globe, we also have a solemn duty to protect our own citizens. We need time to review and implement policies that will ensure that those who seek refuge in the United States are properly vetted. Effective on October 18, 2017, President Trump issued a presidential proclamation which imposed travel restrictions for Venezuela. The Trump administration has also targeted sanctions against Venezuelan officials responsible for human rights violations, undermining democracy, and corruption. We need to put economic pressure on Venezuela while actively limiting the ability of the Maduro regime to use the U.S. and the international financial system. We also need the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, to continue aggressively pursuing Venezuelan companies and persons that engage in illicit activity. Financial sanctions have also been imposed on at least 22 individuals and 27 entities with links to drug trafficking that include Vice President Tarek el-Aissami. In addition to poor policy choices, a crash in oil prices led to a severe economic downturn in Venezuela. With regard to domestic energy production, I am a strong supporter of policies that will reduce our need to purchase oil from countries like Venezuela. Sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector have been considered, but could hurt the Venezuelan people and U.S. economic interests. America needs an actual all-of-the-above approach to domestic energy production to drive our economy and advance us towards North American energy independence. Our current energy policy, or lack thereof, arguably makes us more energy dependent on foreign sources. This strategy should begin by developing the abundant natural resources we have, like coal and Marcellus Shale in my district, and it should also include continuous improvement of non-fossil energy sources like safe nuclear, hydroelectricity, solar, and wind. A diverse mix of energy sources strengthens the U.S. electrical supply system and ensures that we have low-cost energy to meet our nation's growing needs and fuel economic growth. The American people are incredibly compassionate and generous. We have a rich history of assisting people in other nations around the globe, and we provide support when they are suffering from humanitarian crises, poverty, oppression, or war. During this 115th Congress, the House has taken actions in response to the growing crisis in Venezuela. On December 7, 2017, the House of Representatives passed the Venezuela Humanitarian Assistance and Defense of Democratic Governance Act, or H.R. 2658. This bill provides humanitarian assistance for the Venezuelan people, defends democratic governance, and combats widespread public corruption in Venezuela. This bill passed the House with my support and now awaits action in the Senate, like so much of our work does. On the same day, the House also passed the Expressing Concern and Condemnation over the Political, Economic, Social, and Humanitarian Crisis in Venezuela, H.Res. 259, with my support. This resolution expresses concern and condemnation over the political, economic, social, and humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. Congress appropriated $7 million in funding to support democracy and human rights efforts in Venezuela in FY 2017. The FY 2018 State Department and Foreign Operations Appropriations Bill recommended $8 million in democracy and human rights assistance to Venezuelan civil society. This funding was incorporated into the House Omnibus, H.R. 3354, which passed the House on September 14, 2017. The administration requested $9 million in FY 2019 assistance for Venezuela. I thank you again for the important work that you're doing, for the opportunity to speak with you this morning, and I look forward to continuing working with you and my colleagues on these important issues. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll continue now. We've seen the United States push for help with allies in the Organization of American States, as well as in Grupo de Lima. So what positions should the United States continue taking? Is this enough, or should they do more? And I'll open it up to the panel.
I think you haven't done it. Go ahead. Okay. Well, I think that the Trump administration has already done 100 times more to help resolve the situation in Venezuela than the Obama administration did in 8 years. But in terms of the application of sanctions, and the congressman has been a leader on this subject of going after the resources that these transnational organized crime conspirators use against us. They use our own financial system against us. And the Treasury Department has endeavored to investigate, identify, target individuals within the regime who are involved in narco-trafficking and, yes, human rights abuses and other things, and denying them access to the U.S. dollar accounts that they have all over the world. For example, in the case of Tarek el-Aissami, the one-time vice president, I guess he's just shifted responsibilities of Venezuela. Al-Assami had at least, I think, $500 million confiscated, and by the way, that's probably about a tenth of what the wealth that he's garnered through criminality over the years. But it's a start, and it sends a message that the administration is not going to tolerate this. And just as importantly, really more importantly, the European Union, Canada, Mexico, Colombia, and others have followed suit and sanctioned these people to deny them access to the banking sector. So they can do their crime, but they can't use our own currency against us. So that's important. But I think it's also important that we acknowledge that this is a narco regime. This is not a legitimate government. We should break diplomatic relations with that government. We should recognize the National Assembly of Venezuela, whose members were elected in December of 2015, democratically, a landslide, incidentally, for the democratic elements in that country, as the only legitimate representatives of the Venezuelan people. And we should encourage others to join us in sitting down with them to map out a future for the country, for the reconstruction of that country, and then mandating some specific measures by the legitimate elements of Venezuelan state. For example, the Supreme Court of Justice of Venezuela, legitimately appointed by the democratically elected Congress, has declared that the presidency is vacant. And I think this is significant. I think all of the hand-wringing that we do and that our policymakers do on these issues, I think it's an important fact that Maduro is not the legitimate leader of Venezuela, and we shouldn't treat him as such. We shouldn't engage them in parlays. We should not encourage multilateral organizations to work with them or intervene in dialogue. We should be working with the friends of the Venezuelan people, with the democratically elected leaders of the Venezuelan people, to map out definitive steps for a transition. And this, everyone understands, falls in the hands of the security forces of Venezuela. And one of the things that the Treasury Department has done is send a message that those security forces in the country that are aiding and abetting this criminal conspiracy are going to be held accountable. And it sends a message that to the others, that some of whom are not involved in criminality, some of whom want to respect the Constitution, that they need to consider the future and consider their options. The problem is that when they do this kind of discussion horizontally among their colleagues, it's detected, and Cuban security rolls up these efforts. I know that that's not an ideal option. Some regarded it as a coup. The coup already happened. The coup's ongoing. You have a coup government in power today, an unconstitutional government, and it's this. Calling for the military to make a move may be unpopular and runs some risks. But what's worse is letting this situation fester, get worse, have a bigger impact on our security. And the other option is that the outside military force is used. And I think people regard that as an even less appealing option. But that's the only way you're going to bring down a criminal conspiracy like the one you have in Venezuela today. And I think we need to consider those things in a more creative way.
Let me try to see if I can provide a little bit of nuance to this. So I think we all kind of, have a general consensus, at least here in Washington, but also with some of our partners in Latin America, that the regime is not good in Venezuela. The regime needs to go. That there's a consensus with that. The difference is on how. How does the regime go, right? So in the past, in the previous administrations, it was more of a democratic dialogue approach to essentially try to negotiate the regime's departure from power. Now it's become a little bit more of a pressure strategy, both diplomatic and economic. But I think in order to be able to get a strategy on Venezuela, which is what is sorely needed right now, is a strategy, not tactics, not sanctions and pressure and multilateral actions, but a cohesive strategy. I think we first have to have a proper threat assessment of what's going on in Venezuela. I think that's missing. Now, I go to Latin America quite a bit, and I spend a lot of time down there, and I've recently been lecturing a little bit on Venezuela to some of our partners in the region, and particularly with the foreign militaries. And one of the things I do to kind of encroach on this conversation, to get a sense of what the real threat is in Venezuela, I tell a story. And I tell a story about a military officer, a military officer that had high political ambitions, that wanted to reach the presidency and did reach the presidency with a revolutionary project to change the identity of the people of not just his country, but the region, to unify them under a national social cultural identity, and then to use natural resources to use his power to be able to export it throughout the entire region. The ultimate goal is creating a unified state to be able to not just to antagonize his enemies from within his country, but also to antagonize what they called foreign intervention. This individual, this military political officer, ended up dying after 16 years in office of natural causes. And when I tell this story in Latin America, almost everybody undoubtedly thinks I'm talking about Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chavez, right? But I'm not. I'm talking about Gamal Abdel Nasser, right? I'm talking about the leader of the Pan-Arabist nationalist movement, the identity of Pan-Arabism. Because Venezuela and Chavismo had more to do with Arab nationalism than it ever had to do with Cuba. Matter of fact, the Cuban Revolution does not resemble the Bolivarian Revolution in its form. This is not to say that the Cubans aren't involved in Venezuela. That's not what I'm saying. It's undeniable that there's Cubans in Venezuela, and they're heavily involved in what's going on the ground in that country. Upwards of, the highest estimates I've heard is about 50,000 or so. That's undeniable. That's correct. That's accurate. That's factual. But strategically, Hugo Chavez did not use guerrilla warfare. He did not use a communist control. He did not use state apparatus. He used what they call in Spanish a democradura, a kind of democratic dictatorship. He used military insurgency. He used propaganda. And he eventually used a concept that has to do with an insurgent state, which I think is greater than a narco state. I think a narco state is very limiting if you look at it in the case of Venezuela. We've had narco states in Latin America in the past. An insurgent state is much different because it's designed around exporting the revolution. If you study socialism and communism, you know the Cubans had this discussion. Matter of fact, the Soviets had this discussion between the Trotskyites and the Stalinists, right? One wanted to export, one wanted to control. The Guevaristas, the Che Guevara, and the Castros, right? The Castros wanted to maintain control. The Guevaristas wanted to export revolution worldwide. You had this conversation in Venezuela with Douglas Bravo and the communists in Venezuela that were the mentors of Hugo Chavez. They've always had the idea of exporting the revolution, never keeping it contained within Venezuela. And if the strategy is to export the revolution, which is very similar to the Nazareth strategy of exporting identity to create a unified Arabic state, which was called at one time the United Arab Republic, then we have to put into place a strategy that has to do with countering a growing revolution. And this is where I think I'm a bit critical of the current administration's policies. I think the policy right now, there's a premise to everything that's happening in Washington and in the Group of Lima and everybody in Latin America. The premise is that the regime wants to maintain control and power. That's the premise. Everybody tends to agree with that. They say the regime wants power, so therefore we have to take away their legitimacy and their stability, and then we remove their ability to keep power, and then we could have a transition to another government. But what if their goal is not to keep power? What if their goal is to create conflict? That is the story of revolution. Regimes come and go. Maduro, Tarek, Celia Flores, they could all recycle themselves. But the revolution is going to keep moving forward. That, if you study the doctrine of Hugo Chavez, if you study Plan Sucre, if you study Plan Zamora, if you study the idea of creating the Greater Colombia, which is very much modeled after Greater Syria, they're ready to leave. They're ready to move. But they're going to continue to advance the revolution because they're trying to create a conflict. They want to delegitimize, they want to destabilize all of Latin America. And it's not just Venezuela, it's Nicaragua, it's Bolivia. They want to destabilize Latin America so that they can delegitimize the United States. And so we have to be very careful about tactical measures that we take if we don't take the whole conceptual strategy as a whole. And that's where I think we're missing here, at least in the discussions that I've had with policymakers in Washington and elsewhere.
Dr. Ellis, do you want to answer?
Yeah, if I could just make a couple quick comments. And first of all, and it's ironic, we just had on June 20th World Refugee Day, and so in many ways, taking a look at the 4 million plus Venezuelan refugees, many of whom I actually believe are, or some of whom are here. First of all, it's also important to understand that this is a regional crisis in a region that is intimately connected through people, through economic flows, et cetera, with the security and the well-being of the United States. And in that regional sense, I just want to emphasize a few things. And I think this senator's excellent numbers also help us to understand this. First of all, obviously, you have a massive flow of refugees coming into Colombia, largely from the Caracas down through the mountain chain into Cúcuta, and some going to Bogota, Medellin, Cali, other places. But also, if you look at the north of Brazil and Boa Vista, a state where, again, you have an increasing number in a sparsely populated place. When you take a look at the greater Caribbean, not only the proximate islands, Aruba, Bonaire, Curaçao, but also, especially the Spanish-speaking parts of Latin America, if you look at the impact in places like Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, if you look at places like Panama City, if you look at places like Trinidad and Tobago, which, especially going across the Gulf of Paria, had traditionally had a interchange with Venezuelans, but the way in which that is changing. Even Guyana, where basically the difficult to cross Esquivel region restricted those flows, you're now seeing more. But what you're seeing also is a change in magnitude and character of the Venezuelan refugees. I mean, there was a time initially where you would see basically those Venezuelans with some means coming to Weston or coming to Orlando or coming to other places in the United States or Europe or taking the resources to South America and setting up businesses. But increasingly, you've really seen Venezuelans, sadly, not only leaving for the sheer inability to feed and take care of their families, but really giving up on the ability to be able to resolve this by peaceful change. But also across the region, you're seeing an impact on crime and the informal sector because that, again, the Venezuelans who are flowing into Cúcuta are coming into a region, for example, Norte Santander, where in places like Catatumbo, you have, not only, cocaine production and major fights between some of the most, difficult remaining criminal groups and other groups in the region. But this is really, even in places like the informal sector in Santo Domingo, the impact on the rest of the region and the degree to which this is a regional crisis can't be overstated. But I just want to say a few things in terms of recommendations that really is the point here. First of all, to have a strategy, and I agree entirely with Joseph, you need a team in place. And it was certainly helpful that Secretary Pompeo was there at the OAS, although the results were not perhaps what we would have liked here in Washington. However, I would emphasize, for example, that having your assistant secretary, and Roger knows this well because he was assistant secretary for Latin America during his time. Nominee Kim Breyer's confirmation hearings are coming up, and just the importance of having the State Department's complete team in place, side by side with the National Security Council, et cetera, really to have the mechanism to formulate that strategy. The other thing, and I know the issue of military intervention comes up. Roger has spoken out eloquently with respect to this. I, as somebody who has worked a great deal and has a great deal of sympathy for the Venezuelan people, obviously everyone here does, one of my concerns as somebody who works on the security side of these issues is it's vitally important that we not encourage a coup or encourage military action if we are not ready to support that action. Because, frankly, a lot of people can die from false signals, and I think it's very important that we be clear and take very seriously whatever signals that we give. And then finally, the importance of distinguishing how we deal with Venezuela, which Roger spoke very eloquently about, versus how we deal with the refugee crisis, which is a related but somewhat independent issue. And so with respect to the refugee crisis, it is important that we have international coordination over the consequences, even if we can't agree how to deal on Venezuela. It's obviously important that we continue pressure for the transition to democracy, whether it's through the Lima Group, especially through the OAS. I think within that pressure, though, it's particularly important that we send strong signals to China and Russia that their backdoor strategy of basically funding a transition to a more functional anti-U.S. regime will not be permitted. I think we need to be very clear about that, or our pressure to get to a democratic Venezuela will not succeed. And finally, to be frank, I think this is something that's a bit radical, and Roger alluded to it, but this idea of do we or do not give diplomatic and other support to effectively a government in exile. Roger alluded to the National Assembly, the Supreme Court, the issue of how we regard the status of the president in diplomatic relations. And it also goes to the contractual calculations of the Chinese and the Russians and others. The degree to which we need to make an assessment to which we can actually create a credible status for some sort of government in exile, and frankly, whether there is a credible and coordinated government in exile on the Venezuelan side. Because if you can create broadly accepted legal standing in terms of decisions that are made about contracts and things like that, then you can begin to change some of the calculations about money. And I'm still a bit on the fence as to whether that is the solution. But I think it's something that merits far more consideration here in Washington and also on the Venezuelan side than we've seen so far.
Professor, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd like to comment on Joseph's remarks on threat assessment is absolutely essential. I think people don't realize that the narrative that the Maduro regime has is deliberately built to counter the United States. And it is a propaganda narrative. When you look at some of the things the Maduro regime has done in the past, such as military exercises in Venezuela, the one they had a few years ago in Maracaibo, where they wanted to paint a picture that the U.S. is still a Yankee imperialist regime and that they use humanitarian assistance as a fig leaf of respectability for intervention in Latin America. Thank goodness we're not living in the 1980s. You know, I was there in the 80s, was also involved in Panama with Just Cause, and I think our neighbors and partners in the region with the Organization of American States in Lima 12, we're making significant headway with condemnation of the Maduro regime, which is before you would not see that. And as you see Vice President Pence's remarks on aid, notice that it's not just geared towards Venezuela, it's geared towards neighboring countries because we cannot do this alone. This has to be a regional effort across the board.
Okay, going back to sanctions, we've seen more than 40 sanctioned individuals in Venezuela. So according to the Department of State, crude oil dominates U.S. imports from Venezuela, which is one of the top 5 suppliers of foreign oil to the United States. U.S. foreign direct investment in Venezuela is concentrated largely in the petroleum sector. So what more options, aside from sanctions, could the United States take or allies in the region? And I'll open it up to the panel.
I'll go ahead and start. I don't think sanctions inherently is a bad approach. I mean, sanctions does put pressure. It has shown some dividends in the past in other situations, similar situations. Sanctions are to me a force multiplier. They're part of a strategy. They're an element that needs to be used at with a certain time and place and be encroached with other forms of pressure and other mechanisms. That said, I think if I understand right, and correct me if I'm wrong, for other folks I know here have had quite a lot of discussions with Treasury, but from the limited discussions I've had with the Department of Treasury on this, the sanctions are essentially designed to fracture the regime. They're basically designed to make the regime choose, I'm going to either be on this side or I'm going to be on that side, right? So that kind of goes into the kind of question of, can you build a internal element within, or not build, that's not the right, can you incentivize an internal element within the Venezuelan military or security forces that can actually take the matters into their own hands? That discussion we've heard about repeatedly. Essentially, it would be a constitutional action. They're not a constitutionally recognized government, but in that, I think that's very limiting. It's very small in scope. I've said this in other interviews. I mean, Venezuela is not in control of Venezuelans. The regime isn't in control of Maduro or Celia Flores or Delcy Rodriguez or Diosdado Cabello or even Tarek. I mean, the regime is in control of extra-regional actors. And in order to take Venezuela to a situation that's more tenable and manageable, we need to remove those extra-regional actors. I don't mean we as the United States. I mean, whoever is going to deal with that, the region, the international community needs to find a way to get. Now, the Cubans and the Iranians are the most problematic because they're on the ground actually doing subversive activity in Venezuela. The Russians and the Chinese are kind of floating at this 20 to 50,000 foot level, either providing armament, financing, or whatever. This is very similar to the situation we face in Syria. Do we negotiate with Russia to see if they could separate from the Iranians? Do we talk to the Chinese and see if they could, move the purse strings to weaken the local power? So the conversation that we have on Syria needs to be connected to the conversation we have on Venezuela, because those two countries are snap linked to one another. You mentioned the oil, right? Well, those two countries are snap linked not just in terms of the energy, because they're both energy producers, but they're snap linked because of their networks that provide the kind of like an OPEC cartel. And in that sense, I think that we look at individuals like Tarek El-Assami, who's the former vice president, now the Minister of Industry and Production. And he's been a very big mystery for the people in the U.S. government. The Department of Treasury sanctioned him last year as a specially designated narcotics trafficker. He's been known to have a very robust money laundering network. But when you unpack who this individual is, he's more powerful in Syria than he is in Venezuela. His family were some of the founders of the Ba'athist movements in Syria that created the conditions so that Hafez al-Assad could come into power, and then later Bashar. So I think we have to get to that level of nuance with Venezuela to understand the networks. I would much rather see sanctions against some of the banking and financial infrastructures in Lebanon and Syria that finance a lot of Tarek El-Assami's networks than sanctioning Tarek. Sanctioning Tarek is playing whack-a-mole. You sanction his front companies here in the Caribbean, and then he creates another one. So I think we have to cut off their international supply lines, so to speak, and then you de-escalate the situation in Venezuela, which really is just a narco regime. It's a regime that's controlled by drug traffickers and organized crime, but manageable within the confines of the country, not with all this international geopolitical support.
Would anyone else like to answer?
Just a few quick comments. First of all, I think we need to make a decision on what our broader approach is to sanctions. Obviously, as Joseph pointed out, the idea of targeted sanctions with limited effect, given that we don't want to do anything to essentially punish the Venezuelan people. But we're getting to a strategic decision where we have to say things are so bad at this point in Venezuela that essentially, to the degree to which targeted sanctions really prolong the suffering and do not effectively dismantle the regime, we may need to consider, even with due compassion for the Venezuelan people, a more aggressive sanctions policies that would go after the financial system, that would go after the the remaining oil, basically in order to try to accelerate that collapse and limit the latitude of Russia and China to be able to take advantage of that and basically play into their hands. Security guarantees, there is a possibility the Venezuelan regime, as it tries to retain legitimacy within military support, lashing out, especially dealing with Colombia and, less talked about but also important, Guyana, which has almost no defense against Venezuelan military, to make it clear that we will stand by our partners in the region if Venezuela does lash out. Also, there's more that we can do to enforce ICID and in other collection actions by companies, such as Gold Reserve, et cetera, now floating through international courts. Billions of dollars in international judgment and basically the legal system and policy direction here in the United States, I think, can help shape that to basically keep the Venezuelan lawyers from continuing to evade, because again, that will put more pressure on the regime. Also, we need to take a look at the broader oil economy. Russia, for example, is trying to get away from being impacted by sanctions through, for example, the acquisition of controlling interest in Essar and the use of the Vadniyar refinery in India to refine some of the oil that's specifically Rosneft. China is building a refinery in Yiyang again. And if they're able to do that, we're going to have them move towards a closed system. And we need to thus look at things to basically prevent Venezuela from having a backdoor so that it can basically skirt the regime of sanctions of basically the legitimate international economy. Also, I think what Joseph said, I just want to reinforce, there is more that we can do in Intel cooperation and Treasury FinCEN cooperation with respect to understanding the money flows and also other attributes of SIAs. I think that's a way that we can help our partner nations. And frankly, it's important that we give senior leader attention. I know that a number of senators here have played very important roles in that. But I think again to have President Trump, to have Secretary Pence, that has been a big help. To have Secretary Pompeo giving leadership attention to this issue front and center, not just when they talk about Latin America, but when they talk in other parts of the world, calling attention to that. I think that's a way of signaling that this is important to us, a place that is literally just across the Caribbean from key U.S. territory.
Could I just jump?
Go ahead.
Very briefly. I think in terms of, first off, the administration is doing some of this. I'm not sure if it's doing all of it, of what we've talked about, but I mean, I know that the Treasury team is drilling down to close off options and escape routes that the regime is inventing. And frankly, we have a lot of great sources and have helped and shared information with the Treasury Department on things that are happening within the regime, on how they're trying to get around the sanctions. I mean, for example, I think there's information that Tarek El-Assami traveled to Europe after he was sanctioned. He thought it was a clandestine trip, but we've shared that information with Treasury, and not only that, but what he was up to. His sister, by the way, is the Venezuelan ambassador to The Hague, and the Netherlands plays an important part, and some of these banks are directly involved in engaging in money laundering and squirreling away billions of dollars looted by by this regime. So a lot of that information is getting to the authorities that are applying these enforcement actions. We have to have a conversation, yes, with the Chinese and the Russians over what's going on in our hemisphere. I think it's disturbing that the Chinese are hosting the Inter-American Development Bank talks, or did. I mean, this is the Americas. The United States should have a preeminent role in this region. I remember when I was Assistant Secretary, my team said, guess what, you get to go to Beijing, isn't this great, to talk about the Americas. And I said, no, I'm not going to Beijing. If they want to come here, they know where to find us. And on the other hand, my successor immediately wandered off to Beijing and spent many days there talking to the Chinese about what's happening in our hemisphere. But I hope they're getting the right message. I think the Chinese see this Venezuela thing as basically a commercial thing. There's some elements within Venezuela. There's some elements where they are pushing in on security front and in a risky way in Venezuela. But basically, I think the Chinese see this as a commercial thing, and they've closed their checkbooks to this regime because they realize it's a losing proposition, throwing good money after bad. The Russians are a different thing. They have Igor Sechin manages this for Putin, and yes, they have a commercial interest. But frankly, if we go and tell them that we're not crazy about the destabilization of the Western Hemisphere and carrying a threat potentially right to our border, the Russians say, wow, isn't that a shame that you're not happy with that? So the Russians have a completely different attitude. I think it's important to see that what's going on here is transnational organized crime, which generates globally $850 billion every year, and engaging in all sort. Only about a third of which, maybe 40% of which is narco trafficking. And so what they're doing is optimizing a supply chain. They've got, Colombia, the explosion of coca because of a foolhardy peace process there that wasn't managed correctly. Letting down the guard. We've lost a lot of terrain in Colombia because of that. You have a complicit narco state where ELN and FARC camps, basically these are narco traffickers, operating deep into Venezuelan territory like never before. Carrying this cocaine to Europe and to the United States, and up, you see the decimation of institutions in Central America, so that the state there can't even try to resist the narco trafficking. And now we're talking Mexico, which will have elections on July 1st, where the front runner has said publicly on 2 occasions that we needed to look at amnesty for narco traffickers. So this is an organized crime laying waste to institutions that stand in their way in all of the countries that I mentioned, and are going to carry this cocaine production and transit system right up to the North American market. And they're incredibly efficient. and they have some nation states like, as I mentioned, Venezuela and Russia that are helping them in that criminality, and that's the threat that we're confronting, and that's why when you look at asymmetrical tools like financial sanctions to dismantle these networks, that is one way to respond to the threat.
Dr. Ellis, you had mentioned that you don't encourage military action if we can't support it. However, President Trump has also just suggested the possibility of military option for Venezuela is on the table, hinting at a possible U.S. or multilateral intervention to stop the country's collapse. What could be the outcome of this, and how do we deal with a higher refugee outflow, especially for neighboring countries?
That's a great question. It's a very, it's much more complex than I think is often represented. And I think, first of all, there is a certain value of the administration's ability to, keep the Venezuelan military and others guessing about what could happen. However, also recognizing that given our past history of engagement in the region, some of those implications can backfire on us in terms of the strategic messaging. And I think we saw that even with the President Santos in Colombia and others, close U.S. allies, how that was they felt obligated to repudiate those things. It's also important to distinguish between assistance through and for our partners in the region versus basically boots on the ground in Venezuela. Again, you have certain specific risks that the Venezuelan military could do in the waning days of a collapsing regime. Again, there's a lot of Russian-supplied Venezuelan armor that could, at least for 2 or 3 days before they run out of gas and logistics, cross La Guajira and create a real problem for our Colombian neighbors. And I think we need to be attentive for what we can do working with the Colombians with respect to that. Again, something similar, as I mentioned, in Esquibo and in Guyana with, basically the Granger government, who is, again, a friend and an important strategic ally of the United States and the often forgotten Guyana Shield. But again, given U.S. commitments and a high U.S. op-tempo in Afghanistan and other places, I think it would be a strategic mistake for us to trap ourselves into a sustained commitment of U.S. ground forces. Certainly, if there is a situation, I think that there are things that we can do working with a multilateral force, but only a multilateral force which could extend to peace enforcement as opposed to just traditional peacekeeping. But again, I would say that that's strictly in a multilateral context. I think there's also certain red lines where we should consider transition to other options, and certainly even in the economics domain, if the collapse basically pushes a successor regime into being effectively a Russian or Chinese vassal state. Again, we need to signal to the Russians and the Chinese that would be unacceptable. And frankly, there are certain situations in which we could have a collapse of Venezuela. Again, if things get out of control, if you have a split in the military with some of the junior officers, you begin to have rogue elements of the FARC who control substantial amounts of the countryside in western Venezuela and in others. If you have an escalating situation of violence where it begins to become like Darfur in Africa, there may be an appropriate context for the U.S. to provide logistics and other support. Clearly, in that context, we should work with the OAS. Brazil, who has a great deal of experience in this, and with the non-deployment of Brazil to the Central African Republic, probably is looking for another peacekeeping operation. There are, but we need to do it in conjunction with the Colombians, and frankly, there are others with which we should also coordinate. And I should let me just say a couple of quick things also. What happens in Nicaragua is also key to the calculations of the bourgeoisie in the leadership, because in many ways Nicaragua was up until now one of the options for the Venezuelan leadership to flee to, where they could expect a certain amount of protection. If that disappears, that changes certain calculations in Venezuela. Also, as Roger alluded to, we have a real, we need to be reaching out now to Andrés Manuel López Obrador, especially should he prevail in Mexico. There are certain risks there, but Mexico is going to be playing inherently, because of its traditional leadership role in the Caribbean and in Central America, it is going to be playing likely a stronger role in possibly in Venezuela, and we need to work with our Mexican counterparts to make sure that is at least a positive or neutral role. and also for the Caribbean states. We need to be gently leaning on some of our good partners like the Dominican Republic and in Trinidad and Tobago, who have energy dependence, to make sure that they are part of the solution and not part of the problem.
If I could add to what I've been saying, so to go to your question, Emiliana, you know, is there a potential for a U.S. military action or a military action from within Venezuela? I think that's the most important question, to be honest with you. I think that is where the discussion is right now here, both in Washington and throughout the region. I think everyone's clearly seen that the other options are not really working. Economic pressure, diplomatic pressure, any kind of negotiation strategies haven't seemed to amount to much success, at least on a strategic level. But I think we have to be very careful. To be honest with you, I'll be very frank. I think it's a monumentally bad idea if we get involved in Venezuela. And I was in Iraq myself. I saw, you know, tactically how things went wrong, but also how that led to strategic failures. I think it's also a bad idea if the Venezuelans try to take matters into their own hands. I mean, if we describe what we've been talking about for this last hour, right? Cuban-managed, Russian-armed, Chinese-financed, Iranian-exploited Hezbollah, FARC, right? You think the Venezuelan military has a chance against that? You think they could actually stand up to probably the most powerful intelligence, propaganda, and military-industrial complexes around the world? And there's a reason why Bashar al-Assad's still in power in Syria. He's supported by the same people. So I think we have to be very careful on how that could potentially unravel, because I echo what Evan's saying, that this could turn to disastrous consequences. But let me say this. I even go one step further. I say the regime, and I echo what I said earlier, the regime is not interested in staying in power. I do not believe that. It does not track with anything that I've seen over the last 2 years that I've been tracking this very closely. The regimes come and go. Revolution state. Hugo Chavez, to me, proved this. If Hugo Chavez cared about control and cared about power, he would not have stumped his last year when he had stage 4 cancer. He would have Castro would not have done that. He would have took care of his health. He would have maintained his riches. He would have continued to get the drug traffickers in. He'd still be in power today. But he said, you know what? The revolution must go. That was a very Che Guevara-ist type mentality. That is not a Castroist mentality. And so what you see is you have the regime trying to create a civil war. They're trying to manufacture a civil war in their country. They want to create a civil war so they can create regional wars. That's why Nicaragua and Bolivia are snap-linked. This is what the Bolivarian Alliance was all about. There's a 5-step process to creating a civil war in Venezuela, and this same process is replicating itself in Nicaragua and in Bolivia very soon. It starts with increasing social pressure so that you can create desperation in the conditions so that people actually stand up. In the case of Venezuela, it was food and medicine. Then you move to creating a constitutional crisis. The Venezuelans gave this to the Venezuelan opposition. The regime gave this. They dissolved the National Assembly by their choice and said, here, opposition, now you guys have a legitimate reason to call us unconstitutional. They gave them the argument. Then you ignite territorial disputes. And in some cases, territorial disputes that have been going on for 100 years. In maritime disputes with Colombia, land disputes with Guyana, to be able to dispute the boundaries of where the conflicts are. Then you establish a counter-revolution, and that's where you have all this this outflow of defected Chavistas roaming around the world, saying that they're no longer, they were with the Chavistas, they were completely on board with the revolution yesterday, but all of a sudden now they forgot about it, and they're talking about all the drugs and money that's been moved around. Some of these folks will tell you everything with precision about a bank or a warehouse with narcotics, but can't tell you about the strategic decisions to create a military plan called Plan Zamora. They could give you precision on narco-trafficking, but it won't give you precision on political military strategy. And then at the end, when you go through those steps, you establish the counter-narrative. And not just the narrative that Preston was talking about, what the regime says, but the more important is when you infiltrate the opposition and you control their narrative as well. So now you're controlling two sides of a conflict, and that ensures that the outcomes are to your favor. That same process that I just described is happening exactly in Nicaragua. The grievance is the pensions. It's happening exactly in Bolivia. The grievance is the water. It's moving. In the case of Bolivia, the constitutional crisis is over the referendum. It's systematic, and I think all of us who studied the Bolivarian Revolution since 2004, since it was established, noticed that this was not just a revolution based off of economic political partnerships. This was actually a kind of a asymmetric warfare strategy that one of Evan's colleagues and predecessors at the War College, Dr. Max Manweri, he taught me this. He taught me how to look at Venezuela from an asymmetric lens and to take Chavez seriously, because he's actually moved. When he says, I'm going to attack the United States, he's serious. But he's not going to do it by, conventional tactics. He's going to do it asymmetrically through all these elements of non-conventional force. So that, to me, is where we're at. So if we go battle-rattle into Venezuela thinking that we're going to make a difference, and let's play chess here, what's going to happen? Even through humanitarian assistance, we provide humanitarian assistance to Venezuela. What they're going to spin that. They're going to say that's covert military action, that we're arming the rebels, the same thing in Syria, right? They're going to make that argument. Then what's going to happen? Then we're going to say, okay, we got to get regional cooperation so that they can pressure them. They're going to say, oh, well, Colombia's part of the NATO now. Colombia's part of NATO, that means the Russians have an influence there. The Russians say we have more stake in the Orinoco than the Colombians do. That means now we have to get involved. We're escalating the problem. The goal has to be de-escalation. I emphasize de-escalation. We have to treat Venezuela so it really is just a narco state. We can deal with that. If we create this to a geopolitical catastrophe, that's no bueno for nobody, especially here in the United States.
Could I just say,
go ahead.
I think it's a fundamental misreading of what's going on in Venezuela today, that the current regime doesn't want to hold on to power. I mean, everything they're doing, it's not sophisticated. I grant you, it's not a sophisticated strategy. I mean, it's wanton looting and engagement directly in narco trafficking. So we're not talking about a sophisticated strategy of holding on to power, but they're desperate to keep power, because if they don't, they're all going to be fitted for orange jumpsuits and welded into cages by the U.S. federal government, because they're deeply involved in narco trafficking and have killed people along the way to sustain their criminality. So I just think that's a fundamental misreading of this thing. And regarding Chavez going out and campaigning, he didn't have a choice. The Cubans told him, "Oh, you look better every day, Comandante. And you got to go out there and secure your legacy by getting reelected." And so it wasn't, if Chavez wanted to. So I just reject the idea that this regime doesn't want to hold on to power. I grant you, and I think it's an interesting idea of just simply reducing it to a narco state. Frankly, I think that to a certain extent, their Cuban handlers are going to do that already. They're going to pack the Venezuelan corpse and ice, and they're going to jump to Mexico. And they're going to see their new best friend, or actually their oldest best friend, Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico City, and say, hey, we're here to help. And I'm not even saying that what alarms me about AMLO is his socialism. It does to a certain extent, but I'm not a Mexican citizen. And what he does to that economy, I guess, is his business if he gets elected with 50% of the vote. But what alarms me about him is the populism and this determination to break down Mexican institutions, because that's the same pattern that's played out in Ecuador and Bolivia and Venezuela. We've got to get a new constitution. So when AMLO talks about the amnesty for narcos, that alarms me. When AMLO talks about we're going to have a revocatory referendum where midway through my term you can have a vote on whether I stay in office or not. Well, that's right. That's taken directly from Chavismo, because Chavez said that he wanted to do that and then desperately tried to avoid any kind of accountability. But the problem is, the next thing after you say, hey, you can revoke me, he's going to say, yes, but I have some other reforms in mind, which is we're going to have a constituente and we're going to reinvent Mexican institutions. So you'll see the elimination of any kind of checks and balances, a concentration of power in his hands. And I'm not saying AMLO is Evo Morales, coca grower or narco. No, I'm not saying that. But I'm saying he's somebody who can be used by those who want to lay waste to what's left of the very weak institutions in Mexico, so the country is utterly vulnerable to the narco corruption and that activity that's all about getting drugs to our border and destabilizing any institutions that get in their way.
Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, no, this is exactly, I think, the kind of discussion we need to have in Washington. We have a disagreement on the premise of what the regime wants, right? I don't believe they want power. Ambassador Noriega does. I respect that because he has a tremendous amount of experience in this. But, you know, I maintain my position, and it's based off a tremendous amount of analysis. And I'd say, when's the last time you've seen a Chavista in an orange jumpsuit? I'm telling you, we have a lot of indictments. We have a lot of evidence. They find ways to get away. I mean, Villalobos may be the last one. Diosdado Cabello Tarek, they're not... yeah, is less likely. So why do I say that, right? Why do I say? Because historically in Venezuela, the regime, and this is a message, I know we're recording this, and this is really a message I want to give not just to the folks here in the audience, but to all the Venezuelans that could potentially watch this, right? Stop believing that there's a fracture in the regime. Stop believing the same people that carried out the 92 coup, that carried out the 2002 coup, that carried out a potential coup, are the same people that are talking to you right now. They're the same people. They're two groups. They're called the 4 de Febrero. It's named after the 92 coup, the military folks that were allied with Chavez that decided to, kind of a band of brothers, decided to carry with them into the political sphere. And then the Francisco Miranda, the other group, the more kind of Cuban-controlled group, the more communist group that's been involved in the universities in Venezuela historically. These two groups have been basically co-opting institutions and creating a narrative that tricks all the Venezuelans. Venezuela does not have nuclear weapons. It doesn't have ballistic missiles. What they have is the ability to create strategic deception. They're one of the best liars in the world, the regime I'm talking about. The regime has basically be able to trick and pull the wool over everybody's eyes to make them think that they're fighting amongst each other, when in reality all they're doing is creating internal fractures so that they can embed themselves into the opposition and the international community. Why do you think the opposition in Venezuela has historically failed to create any kind of actions that actually create any kind of outcomes in the country that were at all favorable? Was because they were penetrated from day one. And I don't want to say day one, but they were penetrated a long time ago. That tactic, that strategic outlook comes from other revolutions throughout the world. It's called compartmentalization. It's what the FARC has done. It's what the Arab nationalists have done. It's what the Iranians do. It's a very useful tactic, particularly when you're dealing with insurgencies.
I have to cut you, Joseph, sure, so we can continue moving on. Dr. Ellis, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I want to come back to the issue of military intervention specifically. And frankly, I think there is a legitimate compulsion that goes to the heart of who we are as a people here in the United States, but it's also a strategic trap for the United States. And I understand the Venezuelan people, again, many represented in this room who have suffered personal loss, are saying, hey, an illegitimate regime has appropriated our country with Cuban support, with other foreign support. Help us. And we in the United States historically have played that role. And yet at the same time, it has all of the underpinnings of a quagmire with the elements of the FARC, with the Cuban DGI, with the various different Bolivarian groups, with the criminal groups, all of who have a vested interest for different reasons to make this as messy for the United States, much as it's happened in Iraq, much as it happened in other places. So the strategic dilemma for the United States, with all compassion for the Venezuelan people, is, on the one hand, right now, ironically, the suffering of the Venezuelan people. There's probably few things that Maduro and the suffering the Venezuelan regime has done more than to batter the leftist cause throughout the Americas. The wave of movements to the right and center in Latin America has happened in many ways because of the disaster that the Venezuelan's own government has shown in misgoverning its country. And yet at the same time, we in the United States have a choice that the very act of trying to do something with compassion to help the Venezuelan people creates the risk, if done wrong, of turning that into a rallying point against the United States, in many ways like our very well-intentioned and often militarily executed actions in Iraq caused the United States to become that act to become a rallying point against the United States, undermining our strategic position. I'm not saying that we shouldn't consider military intervention under any circumstance, but if we do it badly, we strategically are decimating our position in this region.
Thank you.
Let me just say that I'm not advocating that either, and much more importantly, I don't think President Trump was elected to do that sort of thing. I think he explicitly said he was rejecting the idea of military adventures. That was his expression. I don't think, I think we made mistakes in various places where we've intervened in the past, and I think we can learn from our mistakes. That doesn't necessarily mean that the United States can't do anything anywhere in the world. But I do think in the specific case of Venezuela, it is not an ideal option. That's my personal judgment. That said, I also think it's not possible to have an appreciation for what's going on in Venezuela and say that our response should be to do nothing, or we got to come up with a strategy. I'm cool with strategies, but but there are some things that we can do to test whether there are elements within the government, within the military, that would be people acceptable in terms of going forward and to opening up a political space and restoring some sort of democratic order. Maybe there isn't. I think maybe it's too late. I think we've spent 2 years, too many years, wringing our hands while the Cubans detected anybody that was thinking in an independent way in the military. So we've had this self-fulfilling prophecy that, well, we can't do anything, so let's do nothing. And now, with the passage of time, it's the options it's less attractive to try to encourage some independent elements in the country. So, but I do think we need to think much more creatively in terms of, because we're not going to intervene directly, I don't think. But frankly, there could be some gross provocation that causes us to act. This is our hemisphere. This is not Syria. This is not on the other side of the world. It's happening in our hemisphere, and I think there will be a compulsion by the national security establishment to consider if there is some direct provocation to U.S. security. So I'll just stop there. But let me just one final point. I remember standing in front of Colin Powell in 2004 talking about, can we put 1,500 U.S. military on the ground in Haiti to fortify some kind of stability to guarantee a political agreement with Aristide? The answer was no, and it was coming from the President of the United States and from Secretary Powell himself, who said, Roger, we've done this before. We did it before, and it didn't work. And we ended up committing forces there and not producing the kind of results. 2 weeks later, we had 1,500 troops on the ground. Why? Because Aristide left. And so, and we were guaranteeing then a democratic transition. Now, Haiti's completely different in terms of military capacity and all of that. But there are scenarios could change. Ivan Duque, the new president of Colombia, is on a plane right now on his way to Washington. I can tell you that the presence of narco guerrilla camps deep into Venezuelan territory is a casus belli for Colombia. And so one of the things you need to consider in your thinking is, if we do nothing, this is going to fester into a situation where you have a war between two South American countries in the middle of at the beginning of the 21st century. That, too, is inconceivable. And we get to those scenarios because we talk ourselves into thinking that there's nothing we can do.
Before we continue, we have about 10 minutes left before we open it up to the public, so if the panel can keep the answers a bit shorter.
I'll be very brief. I also want to echo Roger. I agree, actually. Doing nothing is absolutely that's not a strategy. Hope is not a strategy. So to do nothing, I'm absolutely not advocating for a do nothing strategy. That's not what we need to do in Venezuela. But I think the policy needs to be containment. Right? The policy needs to be to contain Venezuela to within Venezuela, to not let it spill all throughout the region. Nicaragua and Bolivia are already becoming similar problems. There are already refugees that are now coming out of Nicaragua, which we haven't seen since the 80s. So that's starting to mess up. So how do you do containment? I think you got to focus on the extra-regional side of this. We're going to have to find a way to dismantle the CTOC, the transnational organized crime networks, dismantle the terrorist networks that are bleeding from Venezuela. We're going to have to negotiate a bit, probably most likely with Russia and China that have heavy stakeholders in that. And then we're going to have to remove Iran and Cuba. And now the way we do that, that's obviously much more nuanced, and it would require probably a conversation that we shouldn't have in this room. But we have to get rid of these actors. If we don't get rid of these actors, we're never going to be able to have any proper discussion on a transition in Venezuela. And the Venezuelans don't have any sovereignty in their country to be able to do it. And not that they legitimately do have their sovereignty, but it's been taken away from them. And it's been taken away from them systematically from this crowd.
So you guys have mentioned that, Humar, especially, the regime wants to create a civil war. But what happens to Colombia and the neighbors, especially in case of a military intervention by the U.S.?
Yeah. So why did I say what's the objective, right? Why would they want to create this kind of conflict? Because it has to do with refugees. Historically, throughout the world, particularly in the Middle East, refugee routes that have been moved from the Middle East to the West have been contaminated with rat lines, basically clandestine routes, to where they're established so that they move networks. Not just terrorists, not just jihadists that move around, but actually logistical men, propagandists, financiers, fixers, folks that actually establish the conditions in other parts of the world so that they can expand this model. There's, I think the UN just released their newest refugee report not too long ago, I think last week or earlier this week, and there's upwards of 65 million refugees around the world today, which is a higher number than after World War II. Now, granted, populations have grown. But as we're doing this, if you start to look at the situation in Venezuela, and I don't want to get too academic on this because it's for time constraints, but if you go back hundreds of years in Venezuela, you start to realize how the rat lines were developed that went from the Middle East to Venezuela, to how the clandestine networks were taken from Latin America and from Middle East and implanted into Latin America. And you start to realize that some of the biggest power structures in Latin America, the illicit power structures, the folks that are running the money laundering networks, they're running the organized crime networks, that was implanted 100 years ago with the pretext of refugees. It was actually done through refugee resettlements that were done with Maronite Christians that came from the Middle East to Latin America 100 years ago. So they are actually experts at this. They're experts at developing this. So why do they want to create that conflict? Because that's the only way they're going to get to 6 million refugees like Syria. And that provokes an international conversation that then the United States almost has no choice but to get involved. And that creates conditions to be able to delegitimize the United States. Any action the United States takes in Latin America is going to be spun by the propaganda that makes it look like we're the imperialists acting aggressively against poor sovereign nations in Latin America. So that's how you win an asymmetric war, is you delegitimize your adversary. You don't have to take them out with military kinetic force. If you delegitimize them to the point that nobody recognizes it or takes away their reputation, then you, by default, win.
Do you want to respond?
Yeah, specifically with respect to the impact in Colombia if there's a U.S. military intervention. First, Colombia would not be the only state affected. We would need to coordinate closely with the Brazilians, especially in Roraima State. There would also be impacts, especially with the Netherlands-owned islands. When we talk about the ABC, Aruba, Bonaire, Curaçao, as well as throughout the Caribbean. There would be also impacts that we need to look at in Essequibo, again in coordination with the Guyanese. But there'd be a series of questions. Number one is whether the Duque government, with a conservative orientation, would or not be willing to essentially stage forces, which would actually be a potential political diplomatic risk with respect to Colombia's relationship with the rest of the region, but also the degree to which whether that type of intervention would create the stage for a broadening the FARC, again with their territorial holdings, as Roger alluded to, within Venezuela, the potential to basically broaden a conflict in which you would have essentially guerrilla elements with territorial stakes acting against essentially U.S. interests both in Venezuela and in Colombia at a critical time for this next stage in the Colombian call it peace process, or at least a situation, the post-accord situation that nobody is fully happy with right now. The conflict itself would probably end quickly. It would probably look a little bit like Just Cause in Panama. However, there is the risk in the early stages of, again, an armor penetration into the Guajira, for which Colombia has relatively limited capabilities to respond to, as well as, frankly, the Russian-supplied Sukhoi 30s could do some damage. It's about, I think, 10 to 15 minutes flight time to basically bomb the Ministry of Defense building in Bogota. And so Colombia, frankly, would suffer damage potentially if there was not preparations for that. And of course, the refugee situation, again, 600,000 refugees. Currently, most of them are coming into Cúcuta. Right now, the Colombian government has tried to avoid the question of refugee camps, even though you have swelling communities in Cúcuta and other places. The question then becomes, if Colombia were to establish refugee camps, who pays for those refugee camps, who takes care of them? Sadly, the lesson for the international community in Haiti is, and in Syria as well, is, if you can avoid refugee camps, do it, because it's a real mess. But the issue of refugee camps on Colombian territory is something that would become a very serious issue. And then finally, the question of the OAS and what would be the OAS role in this type of intervention.
So the panel has talked about the important role of Russia and China in Venezuela. Specifically, China has greatly expanded both its loans and investments in Latin America and the Caribbean in recent years. According to the dialogue, in 2017, China's policy banks have lent $62.2 billion to Venezuelans, with a special focus also on Brazil, Argentina, and Ecuador. How does this play a role in the States playing a moderate position towards Venezuela? And has the United States been too laxed in regards to this situation? And I think that's the last question for us. We can open it up to the panel.
Yeah, that's a great issue. As you look at One Belt, One Road, you look at South China Sea, China's using its influence in a lot of countries that are seeking economic aid. So when it goes to South America and Central America, they're looking for investments. As Ambassador mentioned earlier, China also looks at who's a risk. So when they look at the Venezuela Maduro regime, they see that as a huge risk and they're not willing to go there. Do they have some influence over the foreign policy of these other nations? Possibly, but I don't think their influence is as strong as some other extra-regional actors. I agree with my colleagues this morning. One of the things we desperately need is a cohesive strategy to deal with Venezuela. Because with a transnational, transregional threat moving over into illicit crime networks and the strategy that the Maduro regime has enacted over the years, the federal government here needs to have a good, exhaustive debate and create a cohesive strategy to deal with the situation.
Would anyone else like to add to that?
Yeah, very quickly, as we talk about strategies, I think it makes a lot of sense, really, to have a strategy for Latin America as a whole and the Caribbean, and not just because it's not just a Venezuela problem. Venezuela is where the biggest blister has manifested itself. But we see it at our border. What's happening on our border is a direct result of the decimation of institutions in Central America. And 10 years ago, we sold CAFTA in this building. Central American Free Trade Agreement also included the DR. And we talked about these countries as economic partners. We explained how we dealt with this sub-region. We traded more with them than we did with Russia or India at the time. And now you see these countries decimated because, frankly, the Cubans were better at destroying than we were at building. And that leads me to one final statement on this. We have to, as Al Haig said at one point in the 1980s, we may eventually have to go to the source, and that's Cuba. And I'm not saying invade Cuba, but I delivered testimony to the Government Reform and Oversight Committee last Wednesday, and I said it's high time that we dealt with the international crime spree that's been going on for 60 years by the Cubans, destroying everything in its path in a way that harms U.S. security interests. Venezuela is just the latest example of this. And so we need a strategy not just to deal with Latin America, just with Venezuela, but a broader strategy to deal with Latin America and eventually deal with the crime spree of the Castro regime, which is continuing to this very day.
China's interests in Venezuela are, I think, often misunderstood. Obviously, there is an economic interest in access to the 302 billion barrels of proven oil reserves that Venezuela has. But China also has a strategic interest that, without directly engaging in hostilities with the United States, China does have a benefit from having a state that, if it doesn't sow chaos, at least it is a thorn in the side of the United States and works actively against U.S. interest. And so the question of, is China going to work with the United States? Although China has lent about $62 billion into the region, it actually has done most of that on 3-year revolving credit lines, and so only about 10 to 15 billion is still outstanding. When you consider that maybe a third of the China Investment Corporation's $900 billion in assets are troubled right now. Basically, $10 to $15 billion at stake for a country in which China is actually on the ground pumping out the oil. It actually has in Citibank control over PDVSA's current accounts. So the money is a lot less, and it is a lot less at risk than we commonly assume. And so my understanding is what China is trying to do right now is it is trying to, on the one hand, do the practical things to avoid losing the money that it has, strengthening guarantees, doing things that have been done off the books and moving them onto formal loans, and not putting good money after bad, working through things like basically the high-level mixed commission to coordinate more closely on the projects. But at the same time, my understanding is what China as well as Russia are trying to do is manage a transition to a more viable but still anti-U.S. regime. And you say, well, would China prefer to have a more viable pro-U.S. democratic regime or continuing chaos with an anti-U.S. regime, even though it's not as good for the oil? At the end of the day, I would say while China would prefer the middle ground, I don't think it's in China's interests to allow a solution which goes to a functional pro-U.S. regime. And we need to be clear in terms of what the game then, the very delicate game China is playing, and pressure China in such a way that reflects those interests.
Thank you, guys. So I think we're ready to open up the questions for the audience. I think you have to write your question on a little piece of paper. If you want, you can write it and bring it up to me as well. Okay, so we'll start with this one. Perfect, thank you. And if we could keep it short, 20 seconds at least. What does negotiation in Iran, China, and Russia look like?
Yeah, I'll be very quick. It's like an NTN 24 interview.
15 seconds then.
Okay. I think with China, you have to negotiate the strategic interest, particularly in energy. With Russia, you have to negotiate the armament, and with Iran, you have to negotiate over their network. I actually maybe somewhat disagree with my colleagues on the panel. I think Iran's more important than China and Russia in this negotiation because Iran's network in Latin America and in Venezuela particularly is bigger because they're working with a different clandestine network. They're not working with the historic communists that have penetrated the universities and other parts of society. They're working with an Arab clandestine network, which in terms of numbers, you're talking about the hundreds of thousands. It's a very big network that's mostly involved in money laundering.
Go ahead.
It's negotiating, first of all, the legal basis of future claims to make sure that neither China nor Russia can calculate that they can get to a point where they have a legal basis for their claims over that oil. It's also attacking and pressuring broader interests, the broader interest that China has globally, commercially, in Russia to a lesser extent. And with Iran, frankly, it is the potential of escalating. President Rouhani has a lot more resources than he used to, but he's also playing a very cautious game. And it's a game in which, in many ways, for Iran to come out looking badly in Latin America is still a vulnerability in the Majlis. And so I think there's leverage there to make Rouhani not to want to go there at this moment with the situation in Venezuela.
What legislative solution would you recommend for the U.S. Congress?
I think the House has passed legislation. It's not a mechanical issue. It's me. I think the House passed legislation sponsored by Congressman Ingle that put the basic building blocks. And I think there's legislation that the Senate folks are negotiating right now. I would hope it would. I would hope it would stay bipartisan. Some of the language I've heard is, clearly designed to be a sort of a November November elections kind of a narrative, which divides us on partisan grounds, and I think that's a huge mistake. I think we need to recognize the threat that the Venezuelan regime poses to U.S. security. We should recognize the impact of the refugee crisis and look at humanitarian assistance to address that. And I think we should endorse the diplomacy. We're going to lose Mexico in this diplomatic process, perhaps, when the Lima Group loses Videgaray, the current president of Mexico, Peña Nieto, being much more committed on working with his neighbors to sort of isolate that regime. I think we're going to lose Mexico, but at least we gain the United States, which for the last 18 months has done terrible work, in my opinion, vis-a-vis the regime. Not isolated the regime, not been aggressive enough in our diplomacy, but I think that's going to change. Sorry, I went more than 20 seconds.
No worries. If you want to come up, I can't read the handwriting. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I'm sorry for my poor handwriting.
No worries.
It's just two comments. One for Joseph and Roger. I don't understand why political control and revolution are mutually exclusive. I think you're talking about the same continuing issue. The other is, for Ambassador Noriega, the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary are dead. This is not 1800, it's not 1900. The Western Hemisphere is not ours anymore the way it used to be in the past, because the whole international structure of power is changing. So I think to have that view is self-defeating. I think we have to have a very different view on how to deal with Latin America.
Right. Well, give me some credit for thinking that some things have evolved since the 1800s, 1900, early 19th century. I remember when John Kerry buried the Monroe Doctrine. He did it in the Hall of the Americas at the OAS, and the 300 people there applauded feverishly. And those are incidentally, are the only 300 people in the Western Hemisphere who care. But the problem is that we don't have a doctrine to replace it. And the fact is, and we're seeing this at our border, the southwest border in particular, that threats are still going to emanate from our neighborhood. And my point is not that we shouldn't care about other things or that other countries aren't going to be involved in the Western Hemisphere. My point is, though, that we have to have a strategy. We have to have a policy. We have to take care on this. And it's okay for the Chinese to have a strategy. I don't see the relations with China as a zero-sum game, but we have to be at least as proactive in dealing with this as they are, and that would be my essential point.
I agree wholeheartedly with Ambassador Noriega. I think we have to be a part of the conversation in the Western Hemisphere. It's historic. It's important to us. It kind of just boggles my mind. I was on a briefing the other day about Yemen. There's a civil conflict in Yemen. The Iranians are very much involved. Hezbollah is involved, and there's a lot of U.S. support given to different elements in Yemen to make sure that we can try to stabilize that country. And then when I mentioned, I'm hearing what's going on with the Iranians in Yemen, I said, well, the Iranians are doing the same thing in Venezuela. Like, oh, we don't care about Venezuela. We worry about Yemen. And I was like, well, that's so far away. It kind of boggles my mind how the Western Hemisphere has gotten away from that level of priority in the United States. And let me just say, I agree with you, Dr. Mai, in the sense that regimes and revolutions aren't mutually exclusive. They can coexist. You need the regime to carry out the revolution. But I want to say that it's very tricky how they characterize the regime. I think here in Washington we get a little bit infatuated with personality politics, and we look at one individual or a collection of individuals, Chavez or Maduro. And I think what we want to look at is how the regime has manifested itself into the opposition, because that's the key to Venezuela. And there's people that are very knowledgeable about Venezuela, Venezuelans that will go unnamed, but have given advice to say, if you really want to look at how the regime has manifested their strategic communications, you will look at the financing of the opposition. And then you start to see exactly how they're able to control the counter-narrative. And I think that's kind of what I was going at with that.
For sanctions, how do we remain effective at attacking the regime's source of power, while at the same time preventing overcompliance being rampant and preventing aid from reaching the people suffering? And to that, I'll actually add, and how do we sanction elites that benefited from the government and are now living in other countries, happily ever after?
I'll just make a quick comment, because I think on the sanctions, I don't think our sanctions are all directionally incorrect. I think they've actually identified some very heavy hitters in Venezuela. I think there's upwards of 55 regime officials that are sanctioned right now, and all pretty much the bad actors of the country, roaming from the president on down, actually, that have been identified by our Department of Treasury. What I would like to see is sanctions on the extra-regional actors that are acting in Venezuela, particularly the Russians and the Iranians. There's state-owned enterprises that we know about that the Russians have carried out that are actually dual purpose. They do what they say, whatever it's energy, agriculture, military, but they're actually carrying out a covert purpose as well, the same with the Iranians. And particularly with Iran, I think we have to make it so expensive for Iran to do stuff in Venezuela that they have to start focusing in their neighborhood, in Syria and Yemen and their part, because it's not a cheap venture for them to come out halfway around the world and to start trying to carry out all these different kind of operations in the Western Hemisphere. But if they have the money, they'll continue to do it. If they don't have the money, they'll have to think twice. I won't go into detail here, but there was one of the few successes in Latin America on sanctions in terms of Iran was we almost, through our sanction strategy, almost forced them to close their embassy in Chile in 2012. And I think that kind of abilities would be able to go a long way to removing Iran from the equation.
Go ahead.
Let me just say something maybe a little bit controversial, but I think that at a technical level, the sanctions are very well implemented in terms of the targeting, and I understand the fragmentation strategy. What I would argue, however, is fundamentally that the fragmentation strategy, while probably as good executed today as has ever been the case with any sanctions before, it's fundamentally not working. It's not working because you have intelligence penetration from the DGI and other oversight, and frankly, you have the calculation of the future that we have to stay with the sinking ship, or it's even a bigger risk that we'll all go to jail in the United States. And so, frankly, I think there needs to be a strategic consideration of whether one continues with targeted sanctions or whether one is obliged to move to a broader set of sanctions that go after the financial system and go after what's left of oil sales. And it's only about 600,000 barrels per day. It's a lot less than people think, in order basically to go from trying to target individuals to a different objective, which is basically to bring down the regime as quickly as possible. I'm not advocating it. I'm saying that we need to have that strategic dialogue about the objective of sanctions.
Do you think the Panama-like intervention would be benefited given its success?
I think I should go first on that. But,
go ahead.
I don't look. You cannot compare Panama and Venezuela, and I'm not talking about the Venezuelan military capacity, because if they could get the Sukhoi off the ground or get the tanks started, that would be a major strategic victory for the Venezuelans. And the answer is they can't, really, and you can find the numbers. They're readily available. So, but the arming of the colectivos, tens of thousands of people, the placement of the pushing out in the last 2 years of weaponry, including missiles, into the hands of colectivos, it presents a very serious challenge. And so you need to, the U.S. being able to intervene militarily there, or go in and act. It will be a very, very difficult terrain. That's precisely what Chavez had in mind, and that's exactly what the Cubans have in mind. So I don't think you can compare Panama with Venezuela at all.
Go ahead.
In Panama, After basically a narco-trafficking cabal led mostly by Manuel Noriega had been removed from power, a military force that frankly had worked very, very closely with the United States, that had U.S. doctrine, that had close ties to the United States, who really didn't want to be fighting this in the first place, but did so, basically gave up the fight. And there were relatively limited numbers of other groups with resources to continue the fight. In Venezuela, you have exactly the opposite. You have a military which for 15 years has been systematically stripped of those who work with the United States. And again, you have a lot of residual groups and people behind them with interest in continuing to fight to tie down the United States and blame the United States as much as possible. And so I think it would turn out very, very different than Panama, even though, as Roger alluded to, the technical aspect of what would happen in the first hours or days would probably look similar. You'd probably see a formal dissolution of the Venezuelan military. But the real issue is what happens after that and what strategically would that do to damage the United States.
Should the U.S. consider a TPS for Venezuelans?
It would require a change in public law, because this isn't a natural disaster. This is a man-made disaster. But I think this is the answer to virtually every other question on Capitol Hill. I think we need immigration reform. And I think we need to recognize that a lot of people have fled extraordinarily difficult circumstances in Venezuela, but they're arriving illegally. The denial rate from the U.S. Embassy in Caracas, I heard this, was 98%. That's as high as you get anywhere. And so anybody that's getting here usually is either coming illegally or they're coming and seeking political asylum. You're talking hundreds of thousands of people. I don't think it's I don't think Congress will entertain that thought.
Let me just add one quick thing. This kind of leads into the legislative question that was done earlier, like what can Congress do? And I'm not an immigration expert, so I'm not going to speak on TPS, but I think we need to protect the refugees. We need to provide an equal amount of intelligence support to the countries that are accepting refugees, particularly counterintelligence support, because we have to protect them. We have to make sure that they're not being manipulated, contaminated, infiltrated by subversive elements, which has historically happened in Venezuela and in other networks throughout the world. So I think the Congress can provide that funding allocation. If you talk to Admiral Tidd or any of the folks at Southcom, and the first thing he's going to tell you is, we don't have the money to deal with this. We're looking at a problem that's probably at the magnitude of Syria, with less than 10% of the budget that they have at CENTCOM to deal with Syria. So funding streams can go a long way, particularly if they're within intelligence support and cooperation.
I think one more question, and we'll be done. What is the likelihood of a military coup overthrowing the Maduro government?
Yeah, let me chime in first. Back in 1992, I was a U.S. military observer with the UN in Western Sahara, former Spanish Sahara. We had 2 Venezuelan officers in our team site. One was Air Force, one was Army. So a lot of Venezuelan officers went home on Christmas leave, and that's when Chavez had the coup meeting. And he had met with everybody. Subsequently, coup failed, was arrested. So a lot of the Venezuelan officers elected to stay in the Spanish Sahara rather than go home. And so I asked one of my teammates who was an Air Force officer, I'm like, why did this happen? And he goes, well, culturally, from the armed forces perspective, we look at Simón Bolívar as a hero. That Bolívar, if he thought the government was not right, then we need to make the change. So that guy's age is probably the age of the senior leadership of the Venezuelan armed forces today. You have a younger group, I think, which is kind of what my colleagues have talked about, that go, okay, where does their allegiance really lie? Have they been so thoroughly indoctrinated by Cuban support and Iranian support, and they're watched, similar to other type repressive regimes, that they're afraid to act out or speak out? Or does a regime have a propaganda narrative stating bogeymen in the military so they can remain in power? So it's going to be very difficult for an element within the military to create a coup d'etat or coup de main type situation. And but it's generational, and I think the thing that we need to think about is their families are affected. by this situation, and they're not the senior chiefs like the guy I described who's getting all the money to maintain the power status.
Go ahead, really quickly, 20 seconds.
The short answer is no. First of all, there are attempts that occur on a regular basis that are routinely shut down, largely as Roger alluded to, because you have the DGI and others who penetrate and advise and are rooting these things out. There is, especially, although the senior officers are thoroughly compromised, especially within the National Guard through their acts of involvement with corruption, especially at the junior level, you have, they can see the situation of their own families. They can see the situation of their own loved ones. There is a lot of dissent, and often that dissent keeps people from wanting to actually deploy units out of the barracks because their response is unpredictable. But there's a very real danger that once you start down that road, that you have a split between the Guard and the regular Army, or a split, within the military. Again, in the context of the collectivos, in the context of the other groups, there's a very real danger that situation could actually get out of control and that you unleash the very chaos that you're trying to prevent. And frankly, also, it creates a very dangerous precedent that, we are saying, okay, we are asking the military to basically save the country from a at least superficial election. Now, we know that that's not exactly the case, but I think it's a real Pandora's box that we need to be careful of.
I wasn't going to say anything on this except the last point. Look, this is not a constitutional government. It's an illegal government. And I don't think it's, first off, there is a precedent for this. It's hundreds of years of Latin American history, but the military plays this kind of role and is a guardian of the Constitution. And with that quality of politicians, you can understand why. But frankly, I wouldn't rule out the possibility of something on this front. But what we have to consider is, if there's not a coup, what's going to happen in Venezuela? It's just going to get worse and worse, grow a bigger threat, and then it falls to us to have to eventually deal with this, and that's a very scary scenario.
Sorry, I just want to say something, and I wasn't planning to either, but I sure hope the military has the proper threat assessment to know what exactly they're facing against, if they are going to take an action. I hope they actually know, because if they don't know, they're going to be surprised very quick.
And with that, we end the panel.
Good.
Thank you very much to our distinguished panel today. We have authors of books, columns. These gentlemen have testified before Congress. I think this is the best panel you'll get on Venezuela. So I appreciate you all coming today and hearing about it. I'd also like to thank our partners, Daniel Morgan Graduate School and NTN 24. Great job, Emiliana. Thank you so much for doing it. Tell Gustavo and Moises we said hi and thank you.
I will.
Please do like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, Secure Free SOC. And if you don't already receive our newsletters, please see Kylie Skrupa in the back, and she could add you to that list. Thank you all, and have a great day.